What if the job you have isn't the life you actually want? Mike Lewis listened to his inner voice and then made a truly radical change. Throwing in a prized and lucrative job in finance, he chose to, well, we're going to find out what his real passion was in a moment, and it's a surprising choice. Mike is the author of When to Jump. It's a practical guide to making really big career changes, and he draws on his own experiences. And then he went and interviewed 44 other people who've made some extraordinary leaps. There's the lawyer who became a firefighter, and the garbage collector who ended up being a really good furniture designer. But let's start with Mike's story. What was his jump?
I was growing up as a teenager in a beach town north of Los Angeles, and I discovered the sport of squash. There was a couple courts within probably 100 kilometers of where we lived, and those courts happened to be down the street. And unlike in Australia, squash is very rare, especially west of New York City. I was probably one of 5 kids that wanted to play it competitively on the western side of the United States. And I remember when I was 14, we hosted a professional player who was traveling through town. And he told me about the professional squash tour, on playing on mountains in Brazil and cities in Asia and towns that dotted the Pacific. And I thought, at some point, I want to do what this gentleman did. I want to go play pro. And I wanted it because I'd never left the States. I'd never left this bubble. That was a beautiful bubble, but it was still a bubble. And 10, 12 years later, I was in my job. Like you said, I was working at a venture capital firm. On paper, everything made sense. But I realized 2 things. One was that no one was going to come in and tell me when to go chase my dream. And number 2 is that this voice in my head, this dream somewhere in my gut of playing professional squash, it was never going to go away. And so I had a very clear choice. I either had to listen to it, which was terrifying. The idea that I would leave something that on my CV looked perfect. My parents could tell their friends proudly that I was a venture capitalist. I could tell folks at the bar or down at my flat, this is what I'm doing with my life. That all made sense. And I had to consider leaving it, which was terrifying. And on the other hand, this idea of not doing anything and going to work every day for the next 30 years and thinking about what could have been. And that ultimately seemed more scary.
I was surprised how many people said to you, don't do it. You're crazy. This job that you're doing now is lucrative, and why would you want to leave that? Which makes me think perhaps that was more expressive of their own fears about doing the same thing. How do you know when what you want to do is crazy and what you want to do is just plain stupid?
It's funny you say that. I believe that the thesis of this book is that there's a difference between crazy and stupid. If you look on social media today or read LinkedIn or other places, you'll see stories of people just waking up one day and starting a company and then selling it to Google, or moving to the Himalayas or Bali and having this beautiful life. And if you follow those types of ideologues, you'll wake up, quit your job, and you'll find that it's actually really hard to make all that happen really quickly. That would be what I would say a stupid idea, to wake up and drop everything and try to move to Bali or start a company and expect it all to work. On the other hand, there are what I call these 10,000 unsexy steps that you don't see on LinkedIn, you don't see on your newsfeed or on Instagram. And that happens to be around planning and saving and budgeting and going through this middle ground that comes after you decide to chase your dream and before the glossed over photo on social media. And I believe if you take those steps, and the book outlines the 4 phases of making a jump to take those steps, if you do those proper items on your checklist, your jump will be crazy, but it won't be stupid. And I think that's where I got criticism, was people saying, don't just be brash and impulsive. And I said, well, wait a second, I'm actually going to take 2 years to plan this jump. And yes, it will be crazy. And yes, it was crazy. I packed up my life into a bag and I moved to New Zealand, but it wasn't stupid.
Those 4 steps you describe as part of the jump curve. And the first one is paying attention to that little nagging voice in the back of your head that keeps saying to you, hang on, are you sure you want to be doing this?
Exactly. In the first story in the book, of which there are 44 stories, sectioned off by these 4 phases, we talk about the little voice. It's a karate school manager who turned into a screenwriter. He had failed continuously and told by many around him, even his loved ones, don't do this. And he ends up writing Sleepless in Seattle. He was a middle-class Jewish kid from Pennsylvania. The next woman in the book in the same section describes the same type of little voice, but she was totally different. She was a single mother in her 40s who was a nurse that wanted to be a doctor. She became one of the oldest doctors to go through the Mayo Clinic, around 50 years old when she got her diploma. And I think that the point here is that we all have a voice. It's just super hard to take out the other distractions and noise that come with apps and notifications and our day-to-day commutes and our families. But if you tune in, and that's what this first phase talks about, if you silence the other noise, you'll be able to start to pick up to that voice that you know is nagging you, like you said, and that won't go away. And you can start to listen to it. And that's the first phase.
And planning then is the second phase. You've made that decision in your head anyway. Why is it so essential then to step back and be thoughtful about the process?
Well, I think the process is everything. This is, again, a thought-out, gradual decision to jump. And the book really emphasizes that, which is it's going to take, like I said, these 10,000 unsexy steps. So this section, Make a Plan, really hammers in on what it is like to plan through 3 core pillars. Number 1, the financial planning. Most people can't wake up one day and quit their job. They need to have an income, a paycheck. They may have a spouse, a family, a mortgage to account for. So the financial planning is key. For folks thinking, well, I don't have the money, what I would say is, do you get a flat white every day? Do you stop by and get a croissant on the way to work or at the bus? If you put that money away, $5 a day becomes $2,000 a year.
I know, my husband tells me that all the time.
Right.
On our end, this is Best Practice, and I'm Amanda Woodard, and my guest is Mike Lewis, author of When to Jump, If the Job You Have Isn't the Life You Want. Mike, the book is full of so many good stories, and I've got my favourites, as I'm sure you have. I particularly liked Greg Klassen, who is our garbage guy who reinvented himself as a furniture designer and a very successful one. But what I particularly like about his story is that he really had to face sacrifices. I mean, he went in with a new baby. He hadn't been married that long, and he had a lot of college debt. Now, that takes a lot of guts, I think, because I think it's fair to say some of the people who featured in the book have had quite a secure financial background before they took that jump. But Greg went in with both feet really into an abyss, not knowing whether he was going to make it or not, and was full of self-doubt. But he came through. What are one of your favourite stories?
One of my favorite stories is of a young woman. She's in her late 30s. She's a single mother. Her daughter's around 8 or 9 years old. And she actually contacted me after a radio interview I gave a year before the book came out. And she lives in Boston, and she said, today's my last day as a marketing executive. And she had actually gone to a recovery program called Alcoholics Anonymous to become sober from a battle with alcohol. And what she found in these treatment programs was she loved writing because she could express herself. And now, the day she heard my interview, she wrote to me saying, I'm taking this jump to become a writer. And what she says, and her name is Laura McCowan, and she's now in this book, she describes what she very beautifully conveys as the difference between asking for permission and asking for support. And what she says is that if she looked for permission from her ex-husband, from her parents, she may never get it. Because there's always going to be someone who says, that's not right. You shouldn't go do this. That's crazy, right? And instead, when she decided to jump, she said, I'm not looking for permission. I'm looking for your support. And she had her own set of items to deal with, some debt, uncertain financial future, a daughter. And she jumped because she didn't wait for permission. And by asking for support, she got it. And that was critical to have people in her corner, but she no longer needed their permission.
That single-mindedness that you've described really shines through in several of these stories. I mean, another one is Brenda Berkman, who qualified as a lawyer and then followed really what was her childhood passion, which she'd always wanted to be a firefighter in the New York elite firefighting group. And she wasn't allowed to because she was a woman. She thought that was crazy. But she pursued that. And what is so inspiring about her story, I think, is that by following it through and getting knocked back and even winning, she took them to court, didn't she? She took and won the case. But even after that, she faced harassment and discrimination. And it isn't really a conventional happy ending, that story, but because she had a really hard time. But nevertheless, she doesn't regret it one bit, because it not only benefited her, but she can see that it benefited the wider community by doing that, by taking that jump.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a great story for your listeners here who are thinking, well, what if it doesn't go to plan? And Brenda is a heroine in many ways, because she pushed forward for women's rights. She did something she thought was just, but it didn't come with a happy ending. You know, she faced a lot of discrimination, a lot of challenges up until her retirement. And that's a great example of saying, you know what, some jumps won't end the way you think, but that doesn't make them not worth doing. There's still a worthy cause behind it, even though they might be unpredictable, even up through the conclusion.
And I think it's also worth saying that jumps don't have to be big jumps, do they? They can be small jumps, but just as effective.
Absolutely. Of the 44 stories, we have folks who have pursued lifestyle jumps, side jumps, internal jumps, moving within a company. Folks who are saying, you know what, I like my job, I like my life, but I'd like to learn a language on the side. I'd like to volunteer more on the weekends. I'd like to be around my family more when I can. I'd like to travel once a year somewhere different. And so I think the book actually becomes one around saying you can take agency over your life. You can have control over the decisions that are coming up rather than life telling you where to go. And I think that's what taking a jump is. They come in all shapes and sizes, and that's certainly what we've seen in the 44 stories here in this book.
Mike, thank you so much for coming in. It's been fascinating.
Thanks so much for having me.
Mike Lewis. His new book is When to Jump, If the Job You Have Isn't the Life You Want, and it's published by Hachette. You'll find details on the Best Practice homepage, abc.net.au/rn.